So this is also something I found on morningstar.com. It's also a little bit old, about a year or so old. It shows the capital structure of Starbucks for that time. The orange area reflects what is known as equity, and the dark blue area reflects the amount of debt. So this figure shows that in March 2017, the proportion of debt, how much money Starbucks owes to others, is a little over 41% of total money that it has on its hands. And the historical proportions of debt to equity are similar to that. Now let's look at a little bit more detail on, debt, what exactly it looks like for Starbucks. So at that time, March 2017, this is the kind of bonds that Starbucks had. And notice that I didn't say bond, it's bonds. And by plural, I don't mean that there are many bonds. There are actually many different types of bonds, and each type has many bonds, right? Like the count. For example, we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 rows in this little table. These are different types of bonds. For example, the percentage here, 3.85%, is the coupon rate, right? It's also repeated in the coupon percentage column, 3.85%. The second row shows 2.1% coupon rate, right? So you would take this percentage and multiply by $1,000 face value. That would give you the coupon amount paid every year. Then maturity date, another column. For example, the first type of bonds matures on October 1st, 2023. This means that this is when the very last payment will be made by Starbucks to the bondholders. In the second row, the maturity date is February 4th, 2021. Again, that's when the last payment would be made. Then we also see different amounts in millions of dollars, right? So there were different amounts of money borrowed at different points of time. And in the maturity date column, we see when the last payment would be made for each group of bonds. And so on. So there are, different characteristics of this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different groups of bonds that Starbucks owns. And in the last column, you can also see how the yield to maturity, which is the discount rate, or IY, differs for all these different categories. For example, you may notice that the yield to maturity is by far the highest, 3.99%, for the bonds which have a very long time left until they mature, which is the year 2045. And this is probably because there is so much uncertainty about what will happen in the economy between now and the year 2045 that whoever buys such bonds, they commit to basically a lot of uncertainty between now and the year 2045. And because of so much uncertainty, or in other words, risk, those bond buyers require a compensation which comes in the form of a high return on their money, which is essentially the yield to maturity on such bonds. So there are like a lot of stories that could be told when we compare different groups of bonds. So now let's look at like a different side of bonds. So let's say today there is a company that sells bonds. So again, let's continue talking about Starbucks. So Starbucks decided to sell bonds. Why? Because it needs to borrow money for something that's important for its business. Let's say it sells bonds to Mr. Connery. Then Mr. Connery, he bought these bonds. Maybe they have 20 years to maturity, but he's actually not obligated to hold these bonds for such a long time. He's free to sell these bonds at any time he likes. And let's say at some point he sells his bonds and their new buyer is Mr. Brosnan. And then Mr. Brosnan again can sell his bonds at any time he likes. And let's say they end up in Mr. Craig's hands, and so on. So bonds switch hands. The ownership changes, all the time. Have you noticed the strange last names? Well, remember James Bond? Hint, hint, bonds. That's what this chapter is about, right? Okay, so back to financial securities, right? So what am I trying to say with this, sort of timeline? What I'm trying to say is that bonds can be resold. Somebody sells them, another investor buys them, right? One thing remains: when these bonds mature, when the last payment would be made by Starbucks to the bondholder. Another thing that remains constant throughout the years is the coupon rate, let's say 5%, that determines the coupon payment every year, as well as the face value, which is the additional dollar amount that will be paid at maturity on the very last date. But one thing that will be changing throughout these years is the price on the bond, right? So maybe Mr. Connery sold the bond for $900, but Mr. Brosnan then sell these bonds for $1,200 to Mr. Craig. So the price fluctuates.